So I have a whole lot to talk about today, so I am going to get off to a quick start. Last week, we did Christianity for Absolute Beginners. You got in your groups. You asked me open-ended questions. You put them in the form. 11 of you rank ordered them by which ones were most interesting. This week, my hope is all of you will rank order them, but we will talk about that at the end of class. By your ranking, this was the question that was most interesting. What happened after he, meaning Jesus, was brought back to life 3 days after his death? To start that, I have to say, Jesus, while he was teaching and working miracles, had lots of followers, lots of them. He picked 12, and those 12 he named his apostles. He sent them out as messengers, and they had authority to teach in his name. But the total number of followers or disciples he had was several hundred. And some of them, 2,000 years ago, in what is today Israel, some of them were women. The morning after Jesus, or the third day after Jesus' crucifixion, one of his followers named Mary Magdalene from Magdala, she went to the tomb because it was the tradition then that you would cover the deceased's body with ointments and spices to show respect and to cover the smell as the body decayed. And when there was nothing left, you would take the bones and put them in a smaller container. So Mary went to the grave to prepare his body that way and found the grave open and empty. So she was very upset. She came back out, saw a man standing there who she did not recognize. And the Bible says that she thought the man was the gardener. So she said to him, "Sir, they have taken away my Lord, and I don't know where he is." And the man said, "Mary." And she recognized it was Jesus, and he was alive. What's notable about that, he told her to go and tell his apostles that he had resurrected. Back then, women's testimony was not allowed in court. Women mostly did not speak in public, but Jesus chose a woman from among his followers to be what we now call the apostle to the apostles, the one who went to the men with the news Jesus was alive. After that, he appeared to his apostles in groups. He appeared to some of them individually. And 40 days after he was crucified, he appeared to a group of his followers. There were 500 of them. And he gave them his final teaching. He said, "Take what I've taught you, go to all the world, and share the good news with all of them." And as he was giving them this command, he began to rise. And they watched until they couldn't see him anymore. But it is a Christian teaching that there will be an end to the world, an end to human history, and Jesus will return. And when he returns, he will judge all human beings. So that is what happened after the 3 days. He appeared to Mary. He appeared to groups of his disciples. He appeared to all his followers. He ascended into heaven. And it's a Christian teaching that someday he will return. Question number 2. Where is the accountability of sin if Jesus took responsibility for it already? This is an excellent question. Lots of people struggle with this. If anything you do, no matter how bad, Jesus took the penalty, so you no longer have any penalty to be afraid of, why not just do whatever you want? Why not steal? Why not kill? God's going to forgive you because he already punished Jesus. Here's the answer. The answer has 3 parts. First, we mentioned quickly last week the difference between persuasion and compliance. You drive the speed limit out of compliance. You don't want a ticket. If you believe that people only do good things and avoid doing bad things because they are afraid of punishment, then you believe compliance is all that we are capable of. And it is a Christian teaching that God does not want anything from us that we don't give willingly. God is not interested in compliance. He wants us to choose from the heart to live the way he's shown us. That's part 1. For part 2 of my answer, I am going to give you a very weird example. It's the kind of teacher I am. My students in the United States are used to it. Let's imagine you're walking along one day, playing on your phone. I sometimes do it. As I walk, I do something on my phone and I'm distracted. And you bump into someone and they drop what they're carrying. They were carrying a brand new experimental drug, just been discovered, the only one of its kind. And do you know how much it cost? That much. That is a lot of money. The pharmaceutical company sues you for that amount. You were at fault. Shouldn't have been looking at your phone as you walked. So they win the lawsuit. That is now what you owe. 30 trillion, 230 million, 634, no, 30 trillion, 230 billion, 634 million yen. You are never again in your life going to own anything, because any money you ever earn will go toward paying that judgment, and all the money you earn in your life won't be nearly enough. But then, out of nowhere, steps Bernard Arnault. Bernard Arnault is the chief executive officer of Louis Vuitton. I picked him because I checked. Google tells me he is currently the world's wealthiest person. And he says, you owe that much money? I'll pay it. And I picked that weird figure, 30 trillion. That's how much money he has. So he gives all his money away to pay a debt for you. Now let's imagine you chat with him a little bit, you talk with him. He happens to mention that all his life, it's been really important to him to show respect for the elderly, and anytime he rides a train, he's careful to give up his seat if there are elderly people riding the train, because he has compassion for how hard it is for them to stand up, and also because he thinks that's just respectful. Here's the point of my weird example. The next time you rode the train and saw an elderly person, do you think possibly you might feel motivated to let them have your seat because you felt gratitude for what this man had done for you, and you knew that was something important to him, and you wouldn't do it because you were afraid that if you didn't, he might suddenly jump out of nowhere and take all the money back? It would be a feeling of He treated you with great kindness at great cost to himself. And now you have the opportunity to do something that would bring him joy and that would honor him. So the question, where is the accountability for sin? We talk about Christianity as a relationship and God as a father. And I hope some of you have such good relationships with your parents that you do things, you behave a certain way because that's how they raised you and you know it would make them proud. That's not necessarily about being afraid they'll punish you. It's about looking up to and admiring them. That's where the accountability comes from. Third and final part of my answer. I mentioned in defining salvation last week that it is a process and that you grow and you mature. And when we talk about God as a father, that God in fathering us helps us to mature. A lot of Christians behave really badly. I behave really badly at times. I won't defend it. But a lot of teenagers being raised by good parents sometimes behave very badly. So one part of understanding accountability, it is a Christian teaching in the Bible that God will allow the consequences of our actions to teach us not to be foolish. But here's something I want you to think about in connection with that. With parents and their daughters and sons, there is a different relationship and a different commitment when their daughter or son misbehaves than there would be for a child from the neighborhood. So if you someday have a daughter or son who takes drugs, who steals from you, who is violent with you, you may take extreme measures to try to stop that behavior. But you likely will be committed in the long run to help them thrive, to try to help solve their problems, get them healthy so they can have a good life. But if a child who was not your daughter or son behaved that way, you don't have that commitment. You would simply call the police and let the law take care of it. God, the Christianity teaches, God invites everybody, anyone who wants, to accept the gift of forgiveness and be his daughter or his son. And then when you do not obey, he works to try to correct that so that you will have the joyful life he wants you to have. But if you don't choose it, you're one of the kids from the neighborhood. And the consequences of disobedience and his wrath are on you. That's the Christian teaching. All right. Third question. Are all sins equal in the eyes of God? Whether these sins are committed by people deeply trapped in evil and by people who have devoted their lives to doing good and close to God. I'm combining this with another question lower down, because if I answer this one, I'll also answer this one. How can every sin be the same in the face of God? So, to begin with, think for a minute about something you are good at. Maybe playing a musical instrument. Maybe playing a sport. Maybe you like to play the piano. I've seen a couple pianos here on campus. Let's imagine you're playing the piano and everyone likes it and tells you you're good. Or maybe you're playing basketball with your friends in the park and everyone tells you you're a good basketball player. You've always felt happy about how good you are at basketball. Now imagine someone comes in, sits down at the piano, and they are a concert piano player. a professional concert-grade piano player, and they just blow you away. And you're left thinking, I'm not good at piano at all. Or you're playing a little innocent basketball on the playground, and LeBron James pays a visit and starts playing basketball, and you think, I'm not good at basketball at all. Now, I gave you that example to say this. Last week, I said we are separated from God, and it is a Christian teaching. We can't see, hear, or sense God's presence. But there are a few moments described in the Bible where people do become aware of God's presence, and they have the same reaction every time. They are absolutely terrified. Not because he's angry, because usually what he says is, don't be afraid. But because they see that they are so wrong in every way, so dishonest, so wicked, they don't just think he might destroy them, they think he should destroy them. Because compared to him, they see how badly they've disobeyed. Now, the one person who never had that experience was Jesus. His entire life, he had an open channel of communication with God the Father. And because he never disobeyed, he never felt that God would or should destroy him. So, the question is, how can all sins be the same? And when I said all sins are the same, that oversimplifies it. The Bible does say some sins cause other people more pain. Some sins are, for certain people, it does recognize differences in sin. Murder and gossip are not the same thing in the pain they cause other people. But as far as the question, if you came face to face with God, would your disobedience make you think you deserved for God to lash out with his wrath? Not because of how good he is. And the answer to that question is even the smallest sin that people recognize in themselves, in the face of a holy, perfectly good God, gives them that belief, that perception. We exist, goes the Christian teaching, because God created us, and that is why we owe him obedience. And when we experience directly his standard, even the tiniest sin shows us we've been disobedient. That offense is infinite because God's authority and goodness is infinite. So that is the answer to the question, how can all sins be the same? I have about 2 minutes till I need to move to the next part of the class. I'm going to jump over an illustration I was going to use, a couple of illustrations I was going to use, and try to get to one more question, which is, come on, what's the relation between Christianity and the other Abrahamic religions, Islam and Judaism? Will you explain it? Judaism is the oldest. It's about 3,000 years old. Christianity, 2,000 years old. Islam, about 600 years younger than Christianity. This is an artist's representation of Moses. Moses is important in the history of Judaism. He was given the law by God, and he gave it to the people of Israel. That event was the founding of Judaism, the giving of the law. Near the end of his life, in his final speech to the people of Israel, he said, God will raise up a leader after me. You must obey that leader. Raise up, we sometimes translate as God will anoint. The leader will be anointed. In Hebrew, that's Mashiach. When we try to say it in English, the word is Messiah. And I have one other person from the history of Judaism to mention. That's King David. King David ruled Israel during its golden period. And rabbis today will tell you the anointed one, the Messiah, when he comes, will be like King David. Now, Messiah becomes Messiah in English, but in Jesus' time, the language everybody spoke wasn't English, it was Koine Greek. That's the translation into Greek, Christos. Christos, smoothed down into English, is Christ. So Jesus announced to the world he was the anointed one. He was the Messiah. He lived in Jerusalem, where Israel is now. He was an observant Jew. He spoke of the Hebrew Scriptures. This, a Christian Bible, roughly this much of it, is the Hebrew Scripture, which observant Jewish people would say is sacred writing. Final thing, to talk about the relationship to Islam. It's not my specialty, but I will do my best. Jesus, to Arabic-speaking Muslims, is Isa. Isa is discussed in the Quran repeatedly, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, described as a prophet who worked miracles, and at the end of his life, Allah took him to heaven. And that when Allah judges the world, Isa will come back to the world and participate in the judging. Islam and Christianity part ways 3 ways, possibly 4. First of all, the Quran says that Jesus did not die on the cross, that it looked like it did, and Allah wanted people to believe that's what happened, but that Allah took Isa to heaven. Christians believe and teach Jesus did die on the cross. Second, possibly the worst sin a Muslim can commit, I'm probably going to mispronounce. Shirk, I think. Worshipping multiple gods. And if you say that Jesus is God, you're guilty of it. But in Christianity, that's the basic belief behind everything. Third difference, probably the most important difference. And if you understand this, you understand Christianity, which is the point of this class. In Islam, you behave in a way that brings rewards or punishments. And at the end of your life, Allah will judge and you will find out. Judaism teaches the same thing. You behave in such a way that you collect rewards or punishments, and at the end of your life, in the world to come, you will find out. Christianity teaches you can know right now that you're forgiven. It says it over and over in here. These things are being written that you might know right now, not at the end of your life, because it doesn't depend on how good you are or are not. It depends on how good God is. And people sometimes stumble here because they think this sounds too good to be true. It is too good to be true. It's downright miraculous. That's why it took God to do it. That's the Christian teaching. I have been undisciplined and overshot my time limit by 4 minutes. I have to get better at that. What I want to do, take a break here. That should have opened to where I wanted it. There we go. These are your trios for today. What I would like for you to do is go and sit with them. Let's put group 1 here. Let's put group 9 there. And let's go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I may have butchered some people's names. Quite possibly, Nur is not your last name. I apologize. I did that off the roster. And I will correct it if you tell me how to do your name correctly. But please go and sit with your trio. You can have a couple of minutes to introduce yourselves. Then we'll go to the new content for today. Alrighty, so it is time for me to introduce the topic that we are taking up for the first time today. When I was last week talking about where this class came from, I mentioned a Harvard biologist who had made an argument that the distinction between individualist and collectivist cultures had come from Christianity. That's today. Let me begin by introducing you to Geert Hofstede. Now, some of you may already know a lot about the work of Geert Hofstede. He has published a lot of research about how cultures can be categorized in ways that help us think about communication. He died in 2020, so pretty recently. He was a social psychologist. For a lot of his career, he worked for IBM, and they had offices all around the world, which made it easy for him to collect data on cultural difference. Now, he's responsible for a lot of ideas like uncertainty avoidance, which we will talk about, power distance, which we will talk about. But he said the most important of all of them was the difference between individualist cultures and collectivist cultures, because he said that goes to the heart of where your identity comes from. And I meant to show you that to introduce individualist and collectivist. Let me describe to you some of the characteristics of individualist cultures on the assumption that for my Japanese students and for a lot of students from other nearby nations, your culture may be a little more collectivist. My American students hate when I assign them to work in groups. They will say to me, my grade should only come from what I do, not from what other people do. I can never coordinate my schedule with theirs. It's impossible. In the United States, which is my experience of individualist culture, imposing your sense of right and wrong on somebody else is a very, very bad thing to do. The expression is shoving your beliefs down somebody else's throat. Parents in the United States teach children, and especially teenagers, never give in to peer pressure. Just because the other children, the other teens want you to do something, don't do it. You do what you think is right, not what others want you to do. In the United States, if a group is punished because one member did something wrong, they think that is terribly, terribly unfair. It's not something that you see happen. And finally, a couple of more differences. I have one illustration that I'm saving for the end. When you bring children up in an individualist culture, what you try to do, teach them how to pursue their own dreams. Teach them how to have good sense and good judgment so they can move away from their parents and decide everything for themselves. Let me ask, of students who went to school here in Japan, I've heard this is common, that often the school is cleaned by the students, and often at lunch, one class in the school will get together and serve lunch to the students. That never happens in the United States. They hire people to clean the schools. They hire people to serve the food. And parents' attitude is, school is for educating individuals, not teaching people to work together. Two more things. Does this expression sound familiar to anyone? The nail that sticks up will be hammered down. I sometimes hear it as, the toe that sticks out will be chopped off. And the one I like the best is, the duck that quacks loudest will be served for dinner. But that's the classic one, and I want you to think of that alongside some American expressions. Very often you can learn important things about a culture from what they give as advice. The squeaky wheel gets the grease. That saying, what that's teaching Americans to do, speak up and complain when you have a problem. Because if you don't tell people you have a problem, nobody will solve your problem. But if you complain, people will help you. The squeaky wheel gets the grease. If you want something done right, do it yourself. Very common American saying. You can't let other people tell you how to live your life. In the United States, I'm not saying this is right, but it's a common perception. If you try to make everyone happy, they will interpret that as you are immature and weak. And then finally, in preparing this class, I came upon a study that I absolutely loved. 2012 study. The researchers, it was a team, one from the United States, one from Japan, Stephen Yusen, Toshie Imada. If you'd like to see a copy of the study, I could send it to you. But they gave their students the beginning of a story and asked them to finish the story. They did this just to be careful with two different stories to make sure that the effect would be consistent. One of the story beginnings was about a baseball team. The other story beginning was about a school choir. They named a character in the story. Let's say the character's name was Bob. In the baseball story, Bob gets the chance to play in the baseball game because the star player can't play. Injured, sick, out of town, Bob gets to play. In the choir story, Bob gets to play to accompany the choir for a big, important performance. That was the beginning of the story. And they gave it to Americans, and they gave it to Japanese to try to finish the story. The American students, continuing the story, said that Bob said, "Oh, coach, let me play. I will work so hard. I will win the game for the team." The Japanese students said that Bob said, "Oh no, I can't play. What if I let the team down?" And all Bob's teammates said, "No, Bob, you'll be great. You should play." And then the American students said that Bob hit 10 home runs, and Bob was the hero of the game. And the Japanese students said that Bob played okay, but the whole team played really well, and afterward they all went and celebrated together. And then my favorite part of this study, they took the stories as written by the two groups of students, and they told them to the other group and asked them to repeat the story back. So they took the story of Bob winning the baseball game single-handedly and told the story to Japanese students. And when the Japanese students were asked to remember it and repeat it back, they changed details to where it fit the way they would have told it. So they talked more about the teammates. They had Bob doubt that he could play, and the other teammates reassure him. And the American students did the same thing. They had been asked to just remember the story as told to them, but they couldn't remember it when it didn't fit what they expected. When they told it back, They changed it to what their culture taught them ought to happen. So that is Kurt Hofstede. Individualist cultures, collectivist cultures. Enter Joseph Henrich. Joseph Henrich is a biologist at Harvard. He did this work in collaboration with Duman Bahrami-Rad, who's another Harvard biologist, Jonathan Schultz, and Jonathan Beauchamp, who are both economists. Now, one thing I should say about Henrich and his research previously, he published a book effectively proving that I am weird and that you also are weird. And what he means by weird is Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And he says for each of these 5 traits, this is a minority of the world. A majority of the world does not pursue higher education, live in an industrialized nation, has a lower standard of living, and does not live in a democratic society, and is not Western as he defined it. The problem is, almost all the research published in the social sciences, those studies, those experiments were done with participants who are Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic, and then published as though they are scientific truth. He published that in 2010. Since then, psychology journals, economics journals, communication journals, and other social science publications have become a lot more demanding of researchers. If you're going to make claims, you had better recruit participants who are not all of these, because this is a serious distortion of what we think we know about the world. We make claims about humans when we have only collected data from people that represent a minority of the planet. In 2019, Joseph Henrich wrote another book. Oh, the one last visual I was going to show you. Japanese people are educated. Japan is industrialized. On a global scale, Japanese are rich, and Japan is democratic. The one thing Japan is not is Western. And in 2019, Joseph Henrich published another book, The Weirdest People in the World, going from the first premise about the small group of the world's population who have those traits. This is what his hypothesis that he set out to test. This is what he thought was happening. He compiled a database cooperating with the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. They have records going back centuries of where they sent missionaries who first brought Christianity to different areas of the world. Often, that data even shows what city, what village they reached at what time. So Henrich and his collaborators measured how long has there been a Christian influence for as many communities worldwide as they possibly could. Then what they did, through working with anthropologists, they developed a measure of what they called kinship intensity. Kinship intensity. Kinship intensity is made up of the following elements. Are you allowed to marry your cousins? If it is permitted that you marry first cousins, the daughters or sons of your parents' siblings, that increases kinship intensity. Multiple marriage. In a community, if you're allowed to have multiple spouses, usually multiple wives, then your community has a higher kinship intensity. Do you have extended clans living under one roof? Or do adult children, when they marry, move out and start their own household? If they stay in the clan compound, kinship intensity is higher. Is there an expectation that they will intermarry? Now, that's not very clear. What I mean is, as children reach adulthood and it's time to marry, are they taught they should marry someone in the clan? Or are they taught they should go outside and meet someone who's not in the clan and marry them? If the expectation is that they marry someone in the clan, kinship intensity is higher. And finally, how much authority does the clan have? Are they expected to obey the decisions of whoever is the head of the clan? And what Henrich and his collaborators found, they found the longer there had been Christian, in a very smooth relationship, the longer there had been Christian influence in a community, the lower kinship intensity was. The earlier Christianity reached a community, the more these measures tended to go away. Way back in the 5th century, back in between the year 400 and the year 500 in the Gregorian calendar, the Catholic Church issued a rule, enforced anywhere Catholic priests had any authority, that you were forbidden to marry your cousins, and you were forbidden to have more than one spouse. And Henrich's argument is that pulled extended clans apart. And his interpretation of his data, he says, that's the difference between individualist and collectivist cultures. Let us make the case. They also took the data they had collected, the length of time there had been Christian influence, and the kinship intensity. And they went back and located a lot of published studies about different communities around the world, and to what degree they were individualist and independent, to what degree they taught their members conformity and obedience, to what degree they taught cooperation with strangers. Where there was high kinship intensity, you have a lot of responsibility to your clan and very little responsibility to anybody outside it. So if you meet someone who's not a member of your clan, you don't have to cooperate with them at all. Fairness to strangers. You have a duty to do what's expected, what's dictated by the authority if you live in an extended clan. But cheating people who are strangers, treating them in an unjust or unfair way, in many such communities, they don't have the concept. Fair is something that shows up with what Henrich called impersonal pro-sociality, which we will get to in just a moment. Not quite there yet. And after that first wave of research, Henrich found in his data one more change as the Christian influence and the pulling apart of extended clans, one more change in how people thought and behaved. In individualist cultures, they tended to teach more analytical thinking, that you break concepts apart into their component parts. You think in arguments that reason from premise to conclusion. Less holistic thinking. Less about describing, capturing, evoking. And Henrich's explanation was, in individualist cultures where you will deal with strangers, cooperate them, treat them with fairness, analytical thinking helps you understand the thinking of someone you've never met. Holistic thinking helps you to recognize the attitudes and wishes of people you've known all your life. So the patterns of thinking changed. One more reminder, because I see some people taking pictures and writing fast. You're welcome to. Taking notes helps you learn. The research on that is clear. This will be linked in Moodle. The link will appear today at 3 p.m. So you have the option of relaxing and knowing you can have this later if you want it. But taking notes is still a good thing if you want to. All right. Some of the changed behaviors, specific changed behaviors, as extended clans got broken up. Henrich found in the new independent individualist communities, there was more, there was my finger stuttering. There was more individual ownership. In extended clans, the clan owns it all. If you own it, the clan owns it. When those are broken up, individual private property becomes more of a common experience. You also get to make out your will and say who gets your property when you die. That doesn't exist in extended clan communities. It just goes back to the clan, and whoever is senior controls it. When you don't have to live in the compound, you can go anywhere you want. You can leave. You can move away. And you can make friends with anybody you want. We will talk about relational mobility in here, I think, 3 weeks from now, on the day that we talk about friendship, and about how in some cultures it is measurably easier to make new friends, but also easier to lose them. In independent, individualist cultures, there's higher relational mobility. You can make and drop friends as you wish. The level of responsibility and obligation to those friends is fairly low. And then finally, the invention of social safety nets. You need social welfare programs. You need programs that give food to people who are hungry. If you live in a clan compound, your clan takes care of you. Once those are broken up and the unit of civil society is individual households, if you fall into poverty, if the person who's earning the income gets sick, is killed, there have to be social safety nets. Those were invented when extended clans started to be broken up. So, Henrich took all these observations and said, the sort of summary concept that pulls them all together is this. Now let me define this term, prosocial. Prosocial is the opposite of, and I probably should have put it on the slide, antisocial. In the social sciences, antisocial was coined as a research term first, before prosocial. If I know something is going to cause you pain and I do it anyway, I'm being antisocial. So if this makes a really obnoxious noise and I stand up here, bonk, 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 and I see you're all bothered by it and I think, haha, they're bothered, I'm being antisocial. Prosocial is the opposite. Doing things because you know it helps people. In the kind of collectivist culture that grew out of extended clans, prosociality is interpersonal. You know the people you interact with. You do things that are good for them based on your specific knowledge of them, because almost all your interaction is with people that you are related to, people that are in your very small, tightly knit community. Now, in the kinds of communities that grew out of Christian influence, what developed instead was impersonal prosociality. These ideas were, there are certain things you do for any human being, even if you've never met them. there is fairness. The law should apply equally to everybody. An ongoing problem that my colleagues in the business field who teach international business classes, it is against the law in the United States to give gifts of certain kinds because American law regards them as bribes. They are corruption. You give money to try to get unfair treatment that people with less money can't get. In collective culture, you have a relationship with a friend, so you give them a gift. How could that be wrong? Because in the individualist culture, the norm of impersonal pro-sociality, that's bribing, that's corrupt. If you can't do that for everybody, if everybody can't give a gift like that, it's unfair, nobody should. But under conditions of interpersonal pro-sociality, you know them, they know you, you have a relationship. Why are the Americans so cold? Why do they not believe in the warmth of relationships? So, what comes out of the norm of interpersonal pro-sociality are the following expectations. First, you conform to your peers. What you see your peers doing, that's what you should do. You should be sensitive to shame. This is a longer conversation we could have, but the United States is not an honor and shame culture. It's a guilt culture. Children are taught certain behaviors are right or they are wrong, and if you've done something wrong, you should feel unhappy with yourself. When you are all by yourself trying to sleep at night, you should be staring at the ceiling, unable to fall asleep because your conscience is bothering you because you did the wrong thing. More commonly in honor and shame cultures, the awareness that other people are disappointed in you, that is what regulates behavior. It is common where interpersonal pro-sociality establishes the norm to defer to the leader. We will talk in here. We have a class 6 or 7 weeks from now about power, because how power is communicated and exercised is a huge issue in communication. And the United States is a relatively low power distance culture. And Japan, land of the senpai and the kohai, is a fairly high power distance culture. And lots of collective cultures are high power distance. It's also important to stay loyal to the collective. The group that you belong to, you are very likely to stay with. It is unusual and downright difficult to leave a group that you identify with. Those are the elements making up the norm of interpersonal pro-sociality. So, the rulings on marriage out of the Catholic Church, Henrich's argument is, those loosened up clans, they led to impersonal pro-sociality, including the idea of the free market, and also voluntary associations. The group identity in the communities that Christianity reached, the dominant group identity was the church. And if you don't like the church you belong to, go join another one. There's another one. So, when it came time to test these assumptions, Henrich and his collaborators did a few things. I don't know how many of you in here have ever heard of the Asch conformity test, but we will do a demonstration of it real quick. Let's imagine, you can each imagine that you are the participant in the study. You came to this room, and I put that on the screen. And let's imagine you're the participant. And I say, okay, everybody, here's the task. Which line is longer, the red one or the green one? And starting on this side of the room, You say green, you say green, you say green. We go around the room and everyone is saying green. They're all graduate students. They're not real participants. This is a fake out. And we come to you and every person in the room has said the green line is longer. And in the Ash conformity test, a whole lot of times the participant would look and say, yeah, the green line is longer. Because they would think, I must have misunderstood the question. Something's going on here. They can't all be wrong. People from collective cultures, 20% more likely to say the green line was longer. People from individualist cultures commonly did it, but more of them would speak up and say, no, the red line is longer. What's wrong with all of you? Do you need your eyes checked? The red line is clearly longer. So, a second measure of these assumptions that Henrich and his collaborators found had to do with blood donation. The longer there's been a Christian influence in a community, the higher blood donation is. Now think about it. Blood donation is a very good example of impersonal pro-sociality because you have no idea who the blood is going to. You might donate blood to a family member. That might be interpersonally pro-social. That's not how blood drives work. You can donate for a family member, but blood drives collect blood for the community, which is impersonally pro-social. One of the examples I liked the best was the United Nations. So, the United Nations is located in New York City, and in New York City, parking is ridiculous. There are a zillion places you can get a parking ticket. And there are easily obtainable records. Okay, every person in a nation's delegation to the United Nations has diplomatic immunity. So if they don't want to pay the parking ticket, they don't have to. They can just tear it up, throw it away. But what Henrich and his collaborators found was, in communities that had had a Christian influence for longer, either they didn't get the tickets in the first place because they were careful how they parked, or they paid the tickets. The nations that had very high unpaid tickets that they never paid were the collectivist cultures with the norm of interpersonal pro-sociality. Because making parking available in a city like New York is a real good measure of impersonal pro-sociality. There need to be parking spaces, or where are people going to park? On the other hand, nobody I know needs a parking space. I'm going to tear this ticket up. It's just a government agency. It's bureaucracy. I don't really care. The difference even shows up in Italy. And Italy is the headquarters of the Roman Catholic Church, which is the actor that Henrich and his collaborators largely were studying. Southern Italy was Muslim for a lot longer than northern Italy was. And southern Italy came under Catholic influence a lot later. And even though we're talking two halves of one country bordering each other, the difference in blood donations, the difference in the Ash conformity test are huge between northern Italy and southern Italy. All right. What that then brings us to, this class is about Christian influence that helps explain why Westerners communicate so differently. So what I want to do is talk about a few of the biblical teachings behind that rule against marrying cousins and multiple marriage. In the first half of the Bible, the Hebrew part of the Bible, the one that observant Jews treat as authoritative, there are passages in a book called Leviticus. They don't forbid marrying cousins, but they do say you should not marry close family members. They say things like, you may not marry your sister or brother. You may not marry, if your father takes a wife and then they get divorced, you may not marry your father's wife. All of that is spelled out. In the back half, the sacred writings of Christianity, written largely by Jesus' apostles, there are teachings that if you're going to be a leader in the church, you have to be married to just one wife, not multiple wives. So there was a loose norm in the Bible that backed that up. When the church, the Roman Catholic Church, took that rule and proclaimed the rule for everywhere they had authority and began enforcing it, this is what they were doing. The city of Rome had just passed a municipal law, a city law, that outlawed cousin marriage and outlawed multiple marriage. So the Pope and the associated bishops, they looked at that law and they said, this is profoundly biblical and we are going to adopt this law. Here was their reasoning. They said the Bible teaches that we are commanded to love everybody, not just the people we know. We are commanded to love strangers. And right now, the fact that people marry within their clan and marry their cousins and have these extended family households, that's turning everybody inward. And there were a lot of violent feuds between clans. There was a lot of separating the world into, this is my group, and anyone outside my group is the enemy. So the Catholic Church explained why they adopted that rule. They said, this is meant to compel followers of Jesus to look outside their immediate circle of people they have known to find who to marry. So they will form loving relationships with people further out in the community. Now that's what the Catholic Church said. I have two examples from in the Bible. And when I get through those two examples, I am going to wind down and you're going to get in your trios and you are going to start to generate your open-ended questions. Here's the first example. And maybe I should mention, if you go to the Bible that I have linked in Moodle, and if you have never navigated around a Bible, you'll discover it's separated into these chapters that have names. And when you talk to Christians, they'll say those are books. Well, here I have in my hand a book. Yes, but this has 66 books in it. 39 of them are the Hebrew sacred writing that Jewish people accept as authoritative. The first 39. The last 27, Christians accept as sacred. Jewish people do not. At the beginning of the ones Christians accept, there are 4 of them that are each the story of Jesus. The 2 events I'm about to describe to you both come from the story of Jesus. One of them, Jesus one day had been asked by a man to come to his house because his son was very, very sick. And he said, Jesus, can you come and heal my son? Now, as Jesus was going with the man, there was a woman. This woman had a health problem. It involved bleeding. The words that describe are not precise medical terms, so we don't know what she had. Often, it's described as she was hemorrhaging. But she was hemorrhaging, she was bleeding for 15 years. And in that part of the world, at that time, men did not touch women who were not immediate family. If she wasn't your mother, your sister, or your wife, or maybe your cousin back then, You didn't even make eye contact. And someone who had blood, someone who was bleeding, they were very unclean. So here's Jesus being approached by a woman that he is not related to, and she's bleeding. She is desperate. And what the Bible says is, she knew God was with him, and she thought, if I can just touch his clothing, I can be healed. So she did. She grabbed the edge of his robe. And he, pressing through the crowd, surrounded by people, felt power go out of him. And he turned to his disciples and said, "Who touched me?" And they said, "You're in a huge crowd. What do you mean, who touched you? Everybody touched you." And he turned around and he saw her. And he looked down and he said, "Daughter, your faith is very, very great, and your faith has saved you. Go in peace." And instead of denouncing this woman who touched a man she was not related to and maybe made him unclean because of her blood, he praised her. He said she had great faith and she was healed. That's one example of something Jesus did all the way through the story of his life. He went to people that were outcasts. He spoke to and even touched women who were prostitutes, men who were traitors, who were disloyal to their community. And the religious teachers of the day, in my Christianity for Beginners last week, I said, the reason Jesus was arrested and put to death is he threatened the authority of the religious teachers of the day. They taught good people should stay with good people and stay away from bad people. And what Jesus said over and over again is, I came to go to the bad people because they need me. Now think about the implications of that for interpersonal versus impersonal prosociality. People raised on biblical teachings about what Jesus said, they're taught, go to the people who need you, even if they are not of your group. Praise women who are not related to you, who come to you for help. That is not the kind of teaching that is consistent with interpersonal prosociality. One other example, and one I think is worthwhile for its own sake, just if you will ever work alongside people who are Christians. This is a teaching story Jesus taught, the story of the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan. In 1953, the countries of England and Ireland, they introduced the world's first ever suicide hotline, their version of TEL, and they named it the Samaritans, after this teaching story of Jesus. There was a man who asked, what are the most important laws? What laws are more important than any others out of the ones Moses gave? And Jesus said, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And the man asked, and who is my neighbor? Now and the Bible says explicitly, he asked that question to test Jesus, because he was hoping Jesus would say, your neighbor is your clan. Your neighbor is the people you live with and see every day. But when the man said, who is my neighbor? Jesus said, there was a man who left Jerusalem traveling on the road, and he was attacked by robbers. He was beaten, he was stripped naked, he was left bleeding, about to die. Down the road came a priest who went right on by and didn't help him. After that came a priest's assistant who went right on by and didn't help him. And then came a Samaritan. Samaritans were from a neighboring country. Samaritans and Judeans hated each other. Good Samaritan today, to most Christians, sounds very nice. But if Jesus taught this story today, he could have said the good Nazi. That's how much hatred there was between these groups. But Jesus said this Samaritan bandaged the man's wounds, put him on his donkey, took him into town, took him to an inn, gave the innkeeper money, and said, I will pay for anything this man needs until he is well. Jesus told that story and then said to the one who'd been questioning him, now, which of the people in that story was the Judean's neighbor? And the man said, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said, you go and do the same thing. Now think about that teaching. That, out of all Jesus' teaching stories, is the most famous. If you're ever around people who grew up on what the Bible teaches, who were Christians when they were children, I guarantee you they know the story of the Good Samaritan. Now, if that is that much of a cornerstone of teachings about right and wrong, think about what that does to the distinction between impersonal and interpersonal pro-sociality. The duty, according to this, is if there is someone who is from the group you hate the most in all the world, you still take care of them when they have needs. And if that's what people are brought up on, and Henrich's data are showing that difference is where individualist cultures and collectivist cultures split. That's my argument that is the Christian influence on the difference. So, let me see. This time I am 4 minutes ahead of time. What I was planning to do was to be done by 2:40 so you could get in your trios, generate your open-ended question, and then we could wrap up class. I'm going to let you get started with your trios. I'm going to put the 15-minute timer up in a moment. We will have a few extra minutes at the end to talk about the state of the assignments, what you need to do between now and next Tuesday. But for now, turn to your classmates and stuff you're confused by, stuff you're curious about, stuff you want to challenge. Ready, set,